So good morning and welcome to Monkhouse on Mondays. Today, Mike and I wanted to share with you the results of our latest Operator and Supplier survey. But before we start, Mike, good morning. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. Very well. Pink shirt's looking good as always.
Thank you. Yeah, especially for you today. It's a new pink shirt. So yeah, absolutely have to do that. So Mike, we've done these surveys twice. We did one back in March. We've done one in the last week. And they're targeted at confidence of operators and suppliers. And of course, we are also working on one for customers as well, for consumers. So fingers crossed we'll be able to share that relatively soon. But Mike, what sort of sample sizes have we had in these two surveys that we've done?
Really pleased with the response, particularly to the second one. So we got 123 responses, which is almost twice as many as we did back in March, which I think shows the industry's desire to take part in this sort of data gathering and sharing type exercise, and everyone's really wanting to know, what is everyone else feeling, what is everyone else doing. And the other interesting thing is we had a lot more operators this time. So back in March it was a little bit more biased, or we had more suppliers in proportion taking part. This time the operators have really come through, and we've got a great selection of local authorities, local trusts as we call them, using MBS terminology. The local trusts are the ones that operate only one or two contracts, one of which must be their home. And then we've got the third group in the external partners, which is the larger operators, whether they be private or social enterprise. So we've got a good representation from all three of those in this sample, which is great. Okay,
no, that should be really useful, and that type of information for Sport England, for UK Active, for CIMSPA, and for Community Leisure UK, who all partnered us on this, it's really important to start understanding what their members, what their organisations are doing. So I'm really pleased we got that high number of results. But highlights, Mike. So the intention for us is to put the report out in a week or so's time. We've got some great support from Health Club Management, who are going to put out an article. Do some social media, but let's have a little bit of a tease. What's the sort of two main headlines?
Okay, I think the two things that really stood out for me was we asked a question which we couldn't ask back in March, which was what adaptations had operators made, since reopening. And there was a long list of everything that could have been part of recommendations from UK Active about how to do, but also some other things which weren't recommendations, but were things that they may have been forced in. So we've got a complete range there. Number one of that list is reduced capacity, not surprisingly. So we know, that that's a big chunk. 70–80% of operators have opened with reduced capacity. Quite interesting, that also online booking requirement is right up there as well. Reduced opening hours. The new digital offering is an interesting one. That's not as high as I thought it might be. We heard a lot of talk about everyone rushing towards the digital side of things, but it doesn't look like more than half of operators have actually introduced anything new specifically on the digital side of things. And also what's coming through from these adaptations is the differences between the management models. So obviously one of the big downsides is staff redundancies, and that is up there. It's a significant number of operators have already done redundancies, but obviously big differences between those different management models.
Yeah, and the really sad news, I guess, is the survey's actually reinforced what we're starting to see on social media. Things like, recently Ponds Forge announcement that it's going to be mothballed for the time being, which for the diving community in particular is an absolute tragedy. But we've seen some of that in there, didn't we, where people are talking about actually closing down sites or not reopening them as early.
Yeah, we asked them about temporary closure and permanent closure. Temporary closure is looking about 2 or 3 times more prevalent than permanent closure, but there's a significant minority of operators that have already made decisions to permanently close sites and services.
Yeah, which is going to make it very difficult for an awful lot of communities, because I would guess the sites that are likely to be closed are those that are actually in the harder, poorer areas, where people may not be able to get access very easily now if they've lost their site. But what did the suppliers tell us? What was the sort of key takeaway from the supplier response?
Yeah, it's interesting about suppliers, because suppliers came through 2 key messages, I guess, from suppliers. First of all, they were less happy with the advice, support and guidance that had been given by industry bodies, but more particularly government. I mean, it's fair to say that none of the sector has been overwhelmed with the advice and the support and guidance from government, but suppliers were definitely less happy and felt that perhaps less had been done to help them compared to operators, which I guess is understandable, because the focus, when people outside our sector think about our sector, they automatically think about leisure centres, health clubs, sports clubs, swimming pools. They don't think about so much about the suppliers that we require to keep these things up and running, maintained, but also to keep it all dynamic with new products, new services coming through. So I think a key message for this is, we mustn't forget what the suppliers are feeling and thinking. But the other interesting thing on the upside is that suppliers were much more confident about, particularly in the medium and long term. They're about as confident as operators on the short term. But when we asked about medium long term, suppliers are actually much more confident about their future, about surviving, and less worried about the impact in the medium long term of COVID on the sector.
I think there's a couple of really interesting things there, because of course a lot of the suppliers, actually their representative bodies wouldn't necessarily be UK Active or Sport England, because if you're an engineering firm creating fitness equipment, for example, your guidance would be coming from somewhere else. So actually that really says that UK Active, Sport England, etc. have been very good in supporting the sector, and maybe those engineering organisations or whatever haven't had quite so much support. And the other thing to remember for all of us is that we got no private sector operators within our survey at all. And of course, suppliers supply to the entire sector, not the public sector that we've spoken to. And of course, the private sector will always try and fill the gap effectively, should there be a gap created as a result of the public sector not being able to operate in the area. So it's a really interesting spin when you start looking wider, as you've said, and thinking about the support. But at the same time, certainly for us, ActiveNet, UK Active, suppliers are so important to the working of what we do, because they're creating the innovation, they're challenging us, they're finding new ways of doing things. So I think you're right about making sure we share that support. Okay, so that's really interesting. So Mike, what's the plan? How are we going to distribute this report? How can people get copies?
Okay, so the first thing to say is that anyone that took part should be getting their copy of their report next week. Okay. Also, the key partners that we worked with, and a big shout out to UK Active, SIMSPA, Sport England, and Cloa for their support. So we'll be sending out partner copies to all of those guys, and we're working with Health Club Management on putting together a nice detailed analysis report, which hopefully will be out in a couple of weeks. But if you didn't take part in the survey, we're more than happy to share it to you. So just drop myself or Dave an email. We'll put you on the list, and as soon as that report's produced, we'll send you out a complimentary copy.
Brilliant. Okay, that's fantastic. And I think, Mike, we've already proved it was worth repeating it after 3 months. I think the plan would be to repeat it again towards the end of this year, just to see how people are feeling around that. Maybe we can try and increase that sample and get some of the private sector to take part as well.
I think it'd be really interesting to get the private sector view on this, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, there's so many. There's a lot of difference between how they've reopened to the public sector. So, what are their confidence levels? Yeah,
no, absolutely. I think that would be really important. And if we can combine that with consumer confidence, we'll start seeing a really interesting picture and pattern. So I'm going to leave you to it. I would recommend buying a new pink shirt so that you can match next to each other. Thank you for your time, and we'll catch up soon. Cheers, Mike. Take care.
Will do, Dave. Cheers now.